going to start off with Hamish White, who I see that you're here, Hamish, and you're appearing. Oh, good. There you are. Okay. And he's going to talk to us about Philoctetes. The title of his talk is Insular Intensity, Philoctetes Becoming Lemnos. The handout is in the chat. And Hamish, go ahead.
So first, I would like to thank Chiara and Adrian for organizing this conference and letting me be a part of it. This is actually my first time giving a paper at a conference. I'm quite excited. Grateful for the opportunity to participate. So my paper is titled Insular Intensity, Philoctetes Becoming Lemnos. As that implies, I'm looking at the interaction between the human and environmental affect. So Philoctetes' exile is dominated by Nossos, his diseased foot, the result of an encounter with a water snake, and Anesos, the island of Lemnos, where he's been abandoned for the past 10 years. I'm interested in ways in which these sort of coincide, where his Nossos causes him to become like his Nesos. So for a brief rundown of what I'm going to do, first I'm going to look at ways in which the initial description of the island we're given reflects the symptoms of Philoctetes' disease. Then I'm going to look at his internalization of two affects, that of eremia and of agria, wildness, this latter one connecting him more to the animal world than to the human world. Then like to look at the phenomenon of the echo as a point of contact and almost miscibility between human and environment. Then I'd like to consider ways in which his disease and his affective experience cut him off specifically from the male sort of warrior society of the Greek army at Troy, before finishing by looking at his parting address to the island itself, and ways in which this seems to undercut its surface message of separation from Lemnos. So Philoctetes' ties to the island of Lemnos, a sort of becoming island, are already apparent in the play's opening movement before he's even appeared on stage. So handout 1, Odysseus sets the scene of the play as the shore of the sea-girt land of Lemnos, untrodden by mortals and uninhabited. And sea-girt here is perirutu, and untrodden is astyptos. And both perirutos and astyptos are key words for establishing the isolated nature of the island, but beyond this, they also describe Lemnos in terms which call to mind aspects of Philoctetes' condition with his disease. Here I've translated perirutos with its sort of LSJ definition of sea-girt. More literally, it is flowed around. It evokes the constant liquid motion of the sea on all sides of the island. Moving into section 2 of the handout, we're presented with another vivid image of fluidity a few lines later in the play, at our first mention of Philoctetes. Odysseus says that they abandoned him with his foot dripping all over with a consuming sickness, katastadzonta, in A. Here the force of kata in that katastadzonta invites us to envisage a constant, heavy stream of pus issuing from and soaking over his infected foot. That this has continued from the moment of his abandonment to the present day is soon confirmed when Neoptolemus, investigating his cave, finds, and this is B, rags full with the man's disgusting discharge. This makes clear that for the entire time of his exile, Philoctetes' foot, just like Lemnos itself, has been characterized by a continual stream of fluid. We could perhaps dub it pus-girt, just as the island is sea-girt. Later in the play, handout C, a violent attack of his disease sees further bodily fluids flow around his entire form. His whole body is drenched in sweat, and fresh blood oozes forth from his infected foot. Perirutos, in reference to Lemnos, also highlights the isolated nature of the island, cut off from the mainland by the sea which surrounds it on all sides. In a similar manner, Philoctetes' disease, and the fluid issuing from his body as a result of it, is an isolating force, cutting him off from human society. In the opening lines, Odysseus attempts to offer Philoctetes' cries of pain, to which I will return later, as the chief reason for his abandonment. However, his focus on the physicality of his disease in the form of the dripping pus at the moment he was left behind, that's A again, suggests that this was the primary reason for doing so. Philoctetes himself is also keenly anxious about the unpleasantness his infection causes people around him, which we can already see in B in Neoptolemus's EU. I've given ugh. As he begs Neoptolemus to take him away from Lemnos later on, Philoctetes volunteers to self-isolate in whatever part of the ship causes the least discomfort to its crew. This cut-off nature of Lemnos as an island, pointed to by Periretos, is further emphasized by its designation as protois astiptos, untrodden by men, therefore cut off from humanity. We're now moving into Handout section 3. Examination of the uses of the word Stibbos throughout the play suggests that we are to imagine astiptos as applying to Philoctetes himself as well, albeit in a rather different sense than it does to Lemnos. Throughout the play, the word Stibbos is used almost exclusively to highlight the peculiarity of Philoctetes' gait. Of the 6 occurrences of the word, 5 are in reference to his footfall, and these all occur in the speech of other characters. Prior to his appearance on stage, that is, when the characters and audience have not yet seen it for themselves, the word is used without further qualification, as Odysseus and Neoptolemus watch out for his approach. However, this changes in the build-up to his arrival, and his gait is emphatically marked as other. As the chorus ask Neoptolemus about their task, and about Philoctetes himself, one of their questions, this is 3a, is tin eke stibon, enaulon eturaion. I've given, where does he plant his step, inside or outside? On the surface, this is simply a question of whether Philoctetes is currently in his cave or not. However, we should perhaps read tin eke stibon as asking, what sort of step does he have? It is seemingly this question that Neoptolemus answers a few lines later, when he says, stibon ogmewe, he plows his gait, emphasizing the laborious nature and unusual aspect of Philoctetes' way of moving. This is then furthered by the chorus when he finally draws close to the scene. They describe, in B, hearing the sound of tu stibon katanankan herpontos, someone crawling with difficulty of stepping. Once Philoctetes actually arrives on stage, however, characters cease entirely to use the word Stibbos in reference to him and altogether. It is as if, having now seen how he moves, they no longer find the word to be appropriate. He becomes, or perhaps better is recognized as being, astiptos, this time in an active sense. He does not tread, at least not as normal people do. That Philoctetes views himself in this way is perhaps the reason why he never uses Stibbos of his own movement. Indeed, he only uses the word once, and this final use of the word Stibbos, occurring roughly halfway through the play, highlights the connection between Philoctetes and Lemnos. This is C. As he begs Neoptolemus not to leave him behind, he echoes Odysseus's initial description of the island, saying, "Don't leave me behind, desolate as I am, and apart from the Stibbos of men, the footsteps of men." Chorus anthropon stibu rephrases brotois astiptos from the play's opening, except that now it applies to Philoctetes himself rather than the island. This deliberate echo makes clear that what Philoctetes describes here is more than just a fear of being once again bereft of human company, but a recognition of himself as a mirror image of the Lemnian shore. When Philoctetes is alone on the island, both are astiptos, the one untrodden because the other is untreading. Also significant in this passage is Philoctetes' self-description as eremon. While the adjective can apply equally to people or places, it is used exclusively in connection with Philoctetes throughout this play. We are, however, still given continual reminders of Lemnos' deserted nature. We're moving into section 4 of the handout. In addition to Odysseus' opening description of the island as untrodden by men and uninhabited, we may add Philoctetes' recollection of the moment where he first awoke on the island and saw not a man around, nobody who could help or assist me as I was exhausted by my disease. That's 4a. Further to the island's lack of native inhabitants, Philoctetes explains that visitors never deliberately come to Lemnos either. This is B, as it lacks a harbor, nor is there anyone for sailors to trade with or to receive them as guests. This paints the island as somewhere that is not only uninhabited, but uninhabitable. Indeed, on the rare occasion that someone has put in on Lemnos during his exile, they have treated him at arm's length, at most pitying him with words, or perhaps offering some share of food before departing without him. Given the evident eremia of Lemnos, it is perhaps somewhat surprising that the word eremos is only ever used of the man rather than the island. When introducing himself to Neoptolemus, he repeatedly focuses on himself as alone at the moment of his abandonment, when he was first with the island only. This is Handout C, where the twin generals and the lord of the Cephallenians cast me out shamelessly, Remon, alone like this. Or they exposed me alone and went on their way, O Conde Remon. In understanding Philoctetes' self-designation as a Remon as opposed to the island, I turn to the work of Stephanie Clare in The Sensation of Cold. In Feeling Cold, she focuses on Rashmika Pandya's account of her move from Kenya to Canada as a child. Upon first arriving in Canada, Pandya describes being confronted by a wild, howling whiteness, the chill of the Saskatoon winter entirely unlike her early memories of Kisumu, which are suffused with warmth and color. However, considering these memories as an adult, she notes that in a very real way, I took the cold Canadian prairie landscape within me, and since then have not been able to view myself as separate from those initial memories. This internalization of the cold, Clare argues, is a process of identification, that is, the assimilation and imitation of an attribute of the other. While identification is normally understood in relation to people, body parts, social positions, for Clare, Pandya's account suggests that we can also identify with sensations and perhaps environments. This process of identification creates tension in the self-other divide. As Clare puts in Handout 5, we identify with something that is outside ourselves, all the while coming to internalize that other. I would suggest that a more extreme version of this process of identification with the non-human other has occurred with Philoctetes in his time on Lemnos. Over the period of his exile, Philoctetes has internalized the eremia of the island as an attribute of himself. He therefore does not need to refer to the island as eremos, as his own eremia is able to stand metonymically for that of Lemnos as a whole. However, Lemnos being devoid of human life does not mean Philoctetes is the only living being on the island. We're told by the chorus in 183-5 that he lies alone, apart from all other men, with the dappled and shaggy beasts. Here, an emphatic expression of his solitude, this solitude of the island, which he makes his own, is linked with his closeness to the animals of the island. A similar pairing can be seen in his own words at 936-9, this is Handout 6, as he invokes the entirety of Lemnos to bear witness to Neoptolemus's deceit. O harbors, O headlands, O companionship of the mountain beasts, O jagged cliffs, to you, for I know nobody else to speak to. I bewail these things, ever my companions. Here the geography of Lemnos and its animal inhabitants are addressed as Perusi tois eotosin, ever my companions, and the only things Philoctetes can think of to speak to. This is the effect of heightening his isolation from human society, to which I'll return, but also further links his connection to the landscape with a connection to the wildlife of Lemnos. This latter bond is highlighted by his use of xenousiai, a word typically used for repeated or extended social contact. Its use in the present passage suggests that in the absence of human society, Philoctetes has instead adopted, or perhaps joined, the wild animals as his community. Throughout the play, Philoctetes is presented as having, if you'll pardon the pun, one foot in the non-human animal world. This is most clearly shown in the wildness, the agria, which is frequently linked to him in his disease. This is moving into Handout section 7. Already, in the Parados, the chorus sing Nosemen noson agrian. He is sick with a wild sickness. And they later describe his foot as enteru, that is possessed by a wild beast, at 698. This is a link that has already been made at the very opening of the play, when Odysseus offers the agriais dus femiais, his wild, ill-omened cries, in 7b, as the reason for abandoning him on Lemnos, which suggests the disease has already instilled a sort of wildness in him before the time of his exile. Philoctetes himself confirms this as he rails against the Greeks for abandoning him. That's now 7c. The twin generals and the lord of the Cephallenians shamefully cast me out here alone. withering away with my wild sickness, my agria noso, struck by the wild stamp, the agrio charagmati, of the man withering echidna. Particularly worthy of note here is the juxtaposition of agria with eremon, which, as we have seen, is a key signifier of Philoctetes' connection to the island. Positioning the two directly next to each other cements their relationship as twin consequences of his disease. The polyptysis agrio, ties the wildness of the disease to the wounds he received when bitten by the water snake on Chryse. This encounter with the serpent can thus be seen as a moment of affective transfer, its fangs injecting him with their agria along with their venom. This wild affect Philoctetes takes on as a result of a snake bite is not only that of the snake. When attempting to win him over, this is then 7d, Neoptolemus suggests that his sufferings have come to Philoctetes from savage-minded Chryse. Here, simply referring to Chryse blurs together the goddess, the island and her sanctuary, and perhaps even this serpent which attacked Philoctetes into one figure, as though he had been bitten by the island itself. Here we can see the germ of Philoctetes' affective ties to both animals and the environment in the moment of his snake bite. Yet while this agria may have had its beginnings on Chryse, it develops further during his time in exile. Indeed, when he first introduces himself to Neoptolemus, he says, "Do not shrink back in fear, frightened that I have become utterly wild, apegrio menon." At the midpoint of the play, Philoctetes suffers an attack of fever, and here we see firsthand the agriais dysphemiais for which he was exiled. Initially, Philoctetes attempts to conceal the severity of his affliction from Neoptolemus, but soon, unable to endure the pain of his disease, he loses power over coherent speech and lets out a stream of inarticulate cries full of long, open A sounds, a lot of ah, 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 and atatai, akin to a baying animal. As the scene continues and his pain intensifies, he emits a series of cries, apapapapai, papa, papa, papapapapapai, which repeatedly remix the syllables of papa, papa, daddy, and pai, son, as if his bouts of pain are reducing him to a sort of pre-linguistic baby babble. When he does speak, his sentences are marked by frequent asyndeton and abrupt changes of topic, both reflecting his growing agitation and marking his speech in the episode as other. The frequency and intensity of Philoctetes' cries of pain within the scene show that the periodic attacks of sickness he suffers temporarily heighten the wildness within him, pushing him further to the non-human side of things. We may further note, moving into section 8, Philoctetes' frequent repetition throughout the scene. In A, I've given you some of the repetitions of sound that go on, both in his cries, such as these papa papa pai, and of individual words, such as dierketai, or even sounds, oi moi moi. These repetitions create an echoing effect within Philoctetes' speech, which takes on greater significance when we consider the appearances of actual echoes elsewhere in the play. In the parados, this is B, the chorus sing, Echo, with her lips unbarred, heard clearly from afar, responds to his pained cries. A point Philoctetes himself reiterates as he prepares to leave the island, and recalls how often Hermes' mountain sent back to me a groan that sounded in response to my own voice, that is C. In both these passages, the echo created by the natural features of the island is inextricably linked to his groans as the echo of those groans. That is a sound that exists only as the joint creation of the sickened Philoctetes and his environment. In the formation of this echo, man and environment converge and cannot be meaningfully separated. Shortly before his attack of fever, the chorus expressed their pity for Philoctetes, this is D, as he had no partner in his travails. Pardon. To whom he could cry out a groan that would be answered. The landscape provides this in the form of the echo. Notice stonon and titupon appears in both 1460 and 694, taking on the role of his companion, much as he had addressed it as such in Handout 6. However, this echo has also, in a sense, bounced back and been reabsorbed and reintegrated into the cries which originally generated it, in the form of the repetitions noted above. In these repetitions, Philoctetes assimilates himself to the roles of the mountains of Lemnos himself, creating his own echo as if he were a feature of the landscape. Now, a common thread in Philoctetes' affinity with the Lemnian landscape so far has been the reflection of and compensation for his isolation from human society. I'd like now to briefly narrow in on the ways in which his disease and exile have cut him off specifically from the male-dominated warrior society of the Greek army at Troy. This is going to be Handout section 9. This separation from the male world is heightened through the personification of his sickness, nosos, feminine noun, as a female force. Philoctetes refers to it with the bare feminine pronoun in a, heke gar aute diachronim. She comes from time to time. Hos hede moi oxea foita kai tachea perketai. And she rushes upon me sharply, and departs swiftly. And at 266-7, he calls his wound the stamp of the man withering echidna. We have this above, andropthoru, which we should perhaps read less as destroying men and more as destroying masculinity or manhood. In another evocation of the snake, this is then 9b, Philoctetes refers to it as echidnes hem eteken ode apun, the echidna which has so rendered me footless. As Tillot points out, this is a startling image of castration, the debilitating mutilation of one of his members by the serpent. Here we may note that peos, penis, when contracted, would give us pus. This castrating serpent, a creature that is at the same time female-coded, yet itself a creeping phallus, transmits its own footlessness to Philoctetes, and indeed his movement is at times described as in terms that are very snake-like. We've already seen him katanankan herpontos above, and also at 701, the chorus described him with saying herpe. The snake bite, as discussed above, is the source of all of Philoctetes' troubles. His symbolic castration is the loss that encompasses all others, an emasculation which forces him out of male society. With such strong affective ties to Lemnos having been established in the time of his exile, what should we then make of Philoctetes' eventual departure from the island? At the end of the play, prompted by the Deus Ex Machina of Heracles, Neoptolemus and Odysseus prepare to depart for Troy with Philoctetes in tow. The future Heracles lays out for Philoctetes suggests a complete severance from his present condition. He will go to Troy, be cured of his disease, slay Paris, sack Troy, and send the spoils home to his father Poeas. This is an image of his complete reintegration into Homeric society. The removal of his disease is a reversal of his symbolic castration, and the glory he wins in war is an emphatic affirmation of his participation in warrior society. This integration highlighted by the fact that he will be judged foremost of the army in valor. Arete de protos ekrithes strateumetos, 1425. Philoctetes, too, wishing to stage a self-separation from Lemnos, delivers a farewell address to the island before quitting the stage. This is Handout 10. However, this separation is undercut both by the terms in which he describes it and by the form of the apostrophe. So in Apostrophe, Animation, and Abortion, Barbara Johnson describes the animating power that the apostrophe has, and in Handout 11, I've given the passages where this is spelled out most clearly. The fact that apostrophe allows one to animate the inanimate, the dead, or the absent implies that whatever is being apostrophized is thereby automatically animated, anthropomorphized, personified. The very act of invoking the Lemnian landscape, as Philoctetes does here, is to throw voice, life, and human form into it. And these are a voice and life that have their origin in the speaker, Philoctetes. As such, far from distancing himself from Lemnos, this farewell address has the effect of reinvigorating his connection to it and restaging his affective ties to the land. Addressed as xumphruron emoi, Philoctetes' cave acts as more than simply a home. Much like his earlier invocation of the meadows and headlands as Parousi toiseiotosin, his cave is elevated to the status of companion, one that shares in the experience of Philoctetes' sleepless nights. Philoctetes continues this impression of the landscape as a companion in his recollection of the mountain, providing a stonon antitupon in the form of its echo during the worst bouts of his disease. As seen earlier, the echo is a sound whose creation is the shared product of Philoctetes and Lemnos, a point where neither man nor landscape are separable as its origin. Here, too, we have the reabsorption of the echo into Philoctetes' speech, as we previously saw in his cries of pain. He says, "Leipomen humas, leipomen." Even as he says, "I am leaving," his repetition replays his connection to the island. In this repetition, Philoctetes takes on the role of the landscape he addresses, effectively inscribing himself upon the environment as both sources of the internal echo. Similarly, in describing himself as "keimadzo meno," literally, "when I was stormy," during his fits of fever, Philoctetes assimilates himself to the blasts of the north wind, the plegesi natu, which blow seawater into his cave. Both storms are characterized by wetness. We've already seen Philoctetes' attack of fever cover him with a variety of bodily fluids, just as the storm wind splash his head with seawater. This liquidity is shared in his final address to the island, Kairo lemne pedon ampialon, which returns full circle to Odysseus' initial designation of the land as tes pererutu tonos lemnu. I argued earlier that the designation of the island as Perirutos was an attribute which mirrored the effects Philoctetes' disease has had on him, both physically in the pus dripping from his foot, and metaphorically in the isolation he suffered in his exile. Heracles' prophecy had promised the curing of his disease, both stemming the flow of bodily fluid resultant from it and allowing his reintegration into the masculine society of the Greek army. Yet Philoctetes' emphasis on liquidity in this passage indicates that he is at present still caught between his insular existence on Lemnos and the future promised to him. In recalling both the masculine pounding of the sea and the watery nymphs of the meadows, he imagines Lemnos as a space of gender confusion. His symbolic castration by the water snake, a further watery force, Hydros, had pushed him outside of the male world. These queer waters in his final address suggest that he is still caught in an in-between space, not yet reintegrated into the masculine realm. This focus on water and fluidity also looks forward to Philoctetes' voyage across the sea, which is to immediately follow the end of the play. As he sails to Troy, he will once again be surrounded by water. He will in fact be Amphialon. The meadow nymphs of Lemnos will be replaced by the ocean nymphs, the Nymphais Aliaisin, the chorus call upon for safe travel. As such, despite his geographical separation from Lemnos, the reinvigoration of his affective ties to it in this departing apostrophe suggests that his becoming island has, at least presently, not fully been undone, and he is set to begin a new form of insular existence. If you'll forgive me for finishing by plucking some very low-hanging fruit, it appears that you can take Philoctetes out of Lemnos, but you can't take Lemnos out of Philoctetes. Thank you.